How are you? I'm Richie Baneham, animation director or supervisor for Avatar, and this is Dan Neufeldt, who wrote loads of the lots of the plugins and software that allowed us to do what we did. Let me see. Well, we're here obviously to talk about virtual production and sort of in some ways, the future of virtual production. And to do that, we'll start with sort of a history of sort of how we got there briefly. In about 2007, we actually got it launched into production when we used Motion Builder. I don't know how familiar you are with Motion Builder. We used Motion Builder 7.5, which is quite a few generations ago. We obviously stuck with that during the production, and hence Danimal's role to write a lot of plugins for us became more and more imperative, because again, the software wasn't quite there at the time. But we were able to bend it a little bit and get what we needed out of it. We can even go one step further back, which was 2005. We did a prototype, and we used 6.5. And again, for those of you who know the package, it was pretty dated. And again, in software terms, 5 years is eons. You know, it's like, so there's obviously been huge steps forward. But if you look at like Motion Builder 2011, 2012, it's considerably more comprehensive than what we used, and we were still able to achieve what we did. But I think in the not too distant future, hopefully we'll see some of the discoveries that we made start to emerge in the packages, and allow it sort of to become accessible to everybody to make. Not this type of film, but to utilize the software in a manner like we did. All right, what we'll do is, talking about the sort of future of it, what the next steps for us that we would like to see is sort of a pre-lighting phase, a proper pre-lighting phase. I worked, in traditional animation and visual effects, and it's a very linear process in a lot of ways. Producers obviously need to lay it out in a manner that it can be scheduled, and therefore it tends to go from animation, from the set through animation through lighting, and that has always been inherently an issue, not being able to know fundamentally the lighting before you animate, so you can't adjust your performance knowing where the lighting is going to come from. So one of the things we did during the first Avatar, you'll see up here on top is a template phase. That template phase, there's obviously it's lit in a relatively crude manner. At the time we had access to only 8 lights in Motion Builder. Again, I think that's already changed. But what we had to do was basically create a sense of the light and almost the mood and the direction without having legitimate data that could flow downstream. So inevitably what you end up with is a sort of a template for the light, and the lighter was able to take it and know what it was supposed to look like, place his lights appropriately, and legitimize the lights within the Weta system. But what we're trying to do as we go forward is have a completely legitimate set of lights as we light on set, and even pre-light before we hit the virtual camera phase. So by the time it rolls all the way back around through shot creation and production and goes back to Weta, ultimately what you have is a data flow of the lightings that was set up, not just on a sequence level, but on an individual scene level or a shot level. When you shoot a movie, again, I've tried to do pre-lighting before, and we can do it on a sequence basis, but it's very, very hard to do it on a shot-by-shot basis. And it literally is tweaked by the director and a DP on a shot-by-shot basis. And there's no way to do a lighting setup for every shot before you ever get hit animation. It just isn't possible. Well, this way, when we generate the template, it pretty much will be. It's what you'll end up with out of the package is a jumping off point for your final lighting that's pretty damn close, because it will be lit in the same manner with the same technology that's used further down the pipe at the vendor level. And then from an animation standpoint, which is where I'm a little precious about making sure that the animators understand what the lighting is, because ultimately we end up with an improved animation quite often. By the time it flows through lighting, you realize that the light and how it falls has fundamentally affected the emotion or the sort of emotional impact of the performance. And now you're back into an iterative cycle on what would have been or is an approved piece of animation. Productions and producers don't like to see stuff go backwards in pipelines. They just don't. You know, it seems if you have a final, you want to stick with a final. So anyway, the second phase is the animation phase, and you can see this is how it was lit when we did the final animation. Now, for an animator, obviously, you need to use relatively neutral lighting to be able to see the expression, but you need to also be able to switch over to a lighting setup that would be more reflective of the angles of the lights and understand how it's going to affect your animation or your performance. And then the last one here is obviously the final image. Again, you can see there's obviously a huge difference. The one that lacks any real emotional feel from a lighting standpoint is the animation pass, and it's unnecessary. You know, it really is with where we're going. So hopefully the next big step for us will be you know, a light and a pre-lighting phase that can flow downstream properly. Aye. So I'm going to hand you over to Dan to talk about metadata. But what we're going to do is first we're going to play a clip which shows the sort of editorial process for us and how it was built. And then Dan can talk through like how complex in some ways that is. So, no. So that was the template phase, with how editorial would handle. This is what would be the raw pass in the Avid, built by the editors and turned back over to be assembled before we ever do a camera. As you can see, it's a relatively complex scene. So each individual performer obviously has a reference pass built within the Avid and tracked, and again, being able to track their data, not just on a character performance standpoint, but all of the metadata that exists in the file.
So this is all the elements assembled together in a final rendering standpoint. And if we go back through the main, so this is what our editorial crew would work with. They would have reference video from all these different angles of all these different, we called them crowd tiles. And the way we would handle a scene like this with hundreds of crowd characters is by shooting groups of characters up to potentially 20 if we shot blind mocap. And then every video clip, we have metadata. Metadata is just data that your application, Motion Builder, Maya, the Avid, doesn't inherently understand, but that some other part of your process understands, and you find a way to make it flow through your application so that you can get it out the other side and keep that data and know more about it than just that it's a video clip, it was this take, and here's what time it was shot. So in the Avid, we know what characters are in these scenes, what take it is, and obviously the time code. And then in our Motion Builder file, which I'll see if I can find, you can see in our Motion Builder file, we'll have, I'm not sure if I can find a shot where you can see it, but we'll have the crowd characters in the background. Every character has a special custom properties on them that say what take they're from, what the time code range is on them. And by doing that, we can then look up back to the Avid which video clips for reference to use to see which performers were in there, if we want to, if something of the performance isn't coming through, if we want to take someone out, and if we want to adjust the timing in Motion Builder, we can back calculate that and adjust the reference video in the Avid so that there's again the photographic reference that corresponds to what you have on the Motion Builder timeline. We did that process for all of our shots With the crowd characters is where it gets really complex, but even for like a two-person dialogue scene, you'd have the same effect where you have this metadata describing what take they came from, what the in and out time code is, and from that we can reconstruct, go back to our source mocap data. When we turn over to Weta, they got source mocap data that they would then clean up with the appropriate time range, not do any work outside of that time range, so we cut down the amount of work that they had to do. And in general, we're looking, a lot of improvements have been made between the version of Motion Builder that we use, which is 7.5, and the current version for metadata in general flowing through the pipe. And we could expect to see, you know,
hopefully a considerable improvements in the next version. Again, we obviously, what's grown out of this sort of process with using Motion Builder particularly was, at the very beginning, I would have said Motion Builder wasn't very high on the priority list as far as for Autodesk. But utilizing it in the new manner has obviously breathed new life into the software. And in fairness to Autodesk, they were very good about getting on board with us. And now we have sort of come to a point where we have a very collaborative and healthy relationship moving forward. And hopefully what we'll see is the be-all, end-all, you know, sort of ultra version of Motion Builder hit shelves at some point. And again, like I said, the relationship between ourselves and Motion Builder have begun, or between ourselves and Autodesk, including, you know, Maya, Motion Builder, the whole lot. It's really, it's actually allowed us to really push forward. So hopefully we'll keep making those strides. Well, before we talk about the next thing, we're going to talk about heightened renders, or, you know, sort of quality. What I'll do is I'll just unplug the sound and let this run for you. So at least you have something to look at while I'm talking, rather than looking at me. But so for us, another sort of next gen hope and aspiration is for a heightened visual as far as the visual quality. Already the visual quality that we're able to achieve, you know, on set in real time is considerably better. But we'd still like to push that further. And one of the real kind of advantages to that is to have a sort of the ability to be able to go back to the actor. And you can see here, the actors are working in what essentially is a black box. You know, we give them as much tactile information as we can, or they need to make the performance. But one thing they'll rely on very heavily is to be able to come back and look at this, the template version in real time and understand what their environment is, what it looks like, you know, whether they're close to effects, a waterfall, or, you know, how these tendrils in the scene, you know, how they are luminous, and you know, basically how they, you know, sort of they have this almost tactile creature-like quality. It's like they're almost prehensile. But what we were able to do with this is very quickly shoot the first take or the rehearsals, go back with Zoe and Sam, and give them a look at what they were really supposed to be touching, or much closer to the end visual, you know, what the whole environment looks like. Well, as we get better and better with the visuals, obviously that information is heightened for the actor as well, and it really helps with the likes of, we have a scene coming up. Actually, we'll show it now with the waterfall scene. Unless you want to keep watching this one. Let me see. Yeah. So in this particular case, you can see here, there's a waterfall that's traveling right down on the outside of the actors, which in some ways we obviously tried to make them aware of it, but as soon as we can actually give them a proper visual, run a volumetric sim, include it in the real time, and give them a proper visual on it, they'll be able to.
So in general, the approach that we're looking to take moving forward is to use less and less, wherever we can, of low resolution tricks, and try to, we realize that we'll never be at the resolution of the final image, but we want to use methodologies that are closer to being replicable in the final image. So for instance, if you look at the original lighting example we had up, our lighting values they were all over the board. In one scene, you may have your lights with intensities in the range of 70 to 100. In another, they may be in ranges of 500 to 1,000. Because Motion Builder normalizes all the light values when it renders, or at least at that time, that's how it behaved. We didn't appreciate what we were throwing away then, and what we've realized now is you want to use light values that correspond to the physical values that will be used in a physically accurate render, which Weta does for us down the line, so that when you hand over your shot to them, the elements in the scene, whether they're lights or the waterfall, it's not just something moving in the background, but something with values. Again, this is sort of metadata, but it's more integrated. It's not exactly metadata because it affects what you see in the Motion Builder package as well. Something that can inform or be directly applied to their system to place the lights in the appropriate position, place a waterfall element, which we've based our card upon. And
and I think it also, like I said, informs the actor. And we actually got a fundamentally different performance once we were able to show them the proximity of the waterfall, how close it was to them. Again, their behavior changed. And that's something that we would love to do more and more in the future, is to sort of let the art drive the technology as opposed to the other way around. Being able to instantly turn around and show an actor, what it is they're actually dealing with, and attain an emotionally correct performance and physically correct performance. Obviously saves you having to say further down the line, fix it in post. Again, fix it in post is one of those horrible things that are uttered during production that, hopefully we will, with the advent of virtual production, simulcam, we will see a considerable reduction in how often that phrase is uttered. What we'll do is just play the breakdown. So that was the template phase. There you go. So again, this is the capture phase without any point of reference for the waterfall for Jake and Thierry. But as soon as we dropped in the image and we were able to feed it back to her, we were able to get a sense of how far it was, and she knew how far she could and could not lean out without feeling the spray. And there's a couple of passes where we did it. She literally wiped the side of her ear and flicked it as if she was after getting splashed. So it wasn't the take that we actually used, but it was, again, it informed the performance. And that's sort of, as we go forward, we'd like to see more and more of that integrated into the visuals, so that you can have an instant feedback for the actor. And then obviously we have our animation phase. All right. So the last thing that we sort of are going to talk about or allude to would be collaborative environments, collaborative workspaces, as far as that's one of the next gen things we'd like to solve. We'd be able to have multiple people working towards one file. It's a challenge, and we want to be, one of the things is how to track all that data, and when those changes happen, who made the changes, what version of the file is current. So it complicates all those normal issues that you would have. But for us, I think that the ability to be able to be in an environment, active in an environment with a camera and a director, and him to call out for changes, and those changes to happen like you would on a live action set. If we had Jim or Spielberg or any of those guys who asked for change while you're doing your scout, he would literally would swing the camera, look at something else, and that would be changing as he, on a physical set. Somebody would come in and the grips would start changing stuff. Well, on the virtual side, we usually take the file down, send it off, make the changes, and it comes back to stage. The ultimate goal would be to replicate live action more closely, so that as you're in the file, as you're shooting with directors, you could turn around and shoot the other direction, do whatever the appropriate scene or shots and the pickups that would be, need to be done at that time, and have the changes that are going to be made to the file happening live, but live as in the virtual world. And have an artist that's able to feed directly into that file. So that's, again, that's sort of where we'd like to take it. How realistic and what the sort of time frame for that kind of step forward, we're not 100% sure. Well, we are trying.
It's being worked on.
That's pretty much it for us.
All right. Thank you very much, guys.